which is income. And in this form, with excise taxation, we are going to hit the income when it is used for consumption or whatever. And we see last time the effect that taxation, which means which might imply the increase of the relative price of a good, might have on consumption, when considering a consumer who is making his own choice and in front of an increase of price, how the consumer change is equilibrium subject to is budget constraint. On that basis, we also had a look at how the demand function, the demand that we observe in the market, is derived by the consumer maximization problem. What we look at now is taxation with respect to demand and supply to see whether, and now some effect that we noticed last time when we make this sort of exercise, we assume the consumer consuming two different goods, X1 and X2. And we decided to tax only one good. And we look at the effect on the market equilibrium. And in order to remind the story, we noticed that when the government decides to tax only one good, keeping all the other one fixed at the same price, what happens for a rational consumer who maximizes utility subject to the budget constraint is an adaptation to the new situation, so that in a way it reduces the optimal amount of good consumed, because the price increases with respect to the others. On the other side, we have what we call the substitution effect, which means that part of the income is devoted to consume the other good, which at a certain point is becoming less expected with respect to the taxed good. Okay, so from the point of view of the government, which is the result that we like? Well, we expect in a way, I am the government. I'm Draghi, the minister. And if I put a tax on a given good, and for those consumers consuming that good, I'm expecting a reduction of their income because they found that food more expensive. So this is something that I like, and I like it because I want money, cash to spend for something else, or because I want that consumer reduces the amount of good consumed before of the increase of price. What I don't want, if I were Draghi, is that given the tax eating a given good, the effect of the tax translates on another good or on another market. So this is something that I don't want. And this is what is called the substitution effect, which is something unexpected. No, it's expected because we know that this effect exists, but it's something that I don't want because I choose a different good and I want that good to be it. Okay, and also because it generates, in general, a very bad effect that in the literature is called dead weight loss, or that is dead weight loss in English, which means that there is some welfare of the consumer or of the producer which is completely lost and which the government cannot use in order to have cash to spend for something different. Now, well, this is the recap of last time. Now we look directly not at consumer preferences and budget constraints, but directly to demand and supply function. And the first thing that you have to know is that when we use excise taxation, we have two different kinds of taxes to be used. They are those called specific tax, and the other types is ad valorem tax. Specific tax is a tax that is based on the unit of good. It means that each unit of the good is taxed at a fixed rate. Say, this good in the picture here whatever it is, and assuming this is the supply function and this is the demand function. If I'm using a specific taxation, say on the demand function, it means that each cigarette, say this is cigarette, we are using a butt, is taxed, say €1 for cigarettes sold. Okay. So what happens if the government decides that the demand has to be taxed? Notice that in general, and in all the countries, taxation is decided by law. And generally, mainly in the democratic system, when government decides to introduce a new tax, it decides it by law. So, government introduced a specific tax on cigarettes of €1. What happens? Notice the demand doesn't change. The demand function never changes because, as you know, in this picture here, the demand function is simply determined by the relation between price, relative price and quantity, and comes out from the optimal choice of consumer, given his preferences and his income. So it doesn't change because so much is changing the price. But what changes that affect the market is what the producer is expecting to obtain after having sold his good. That is his revenue. So given that the demand function can also represent the revenue, the potential revenue that the suppliers, the producer of cigarettes, is expecting to receive after market transaction, what is changing in the market is the expected revenue of the producer, which is not longer represented by the demand function, but it is represented by D minus T, this one, by subtracting €1, say this distance is €1 taxes. E is equal to 1.
Non ho capito bene. Prova a dirmi in modo diverso.
Sorry about it. What should I do? My telephone is autonomous. Didn't understand. Okay. Look. Okay. So What happens if government decides to put instead a new tax of a new specific tax of €1 for each packet of cigarettes, but calculated on the supply function? So we have the same situation, but look at this picture here. In this case, the supply function changes because it passes from S, the original one, to S plus T, which is this one. And if you notice the distance, well, what happens is a parallel shift of the supply function, where the difference between the two supply are determined by the tax rate, which is €1. So again, this distance is for each quantity €1. T equal to €1. Okay. Now, assume that we have an equilibrium at point E0 or A0. What is the new equilibrium? Is there anybody that can see which one is the new equilibrium after the introduction of taxation? We are in a perfect competitive market where the government decides to introduce a tax, a specific tax on cigarettes equal to €1 for each packet of cigarettes that is sold in this market. How does the equilibrium changes? Is there anybody that can see? At first, we have this equilibrium where the quantity of cigarette consumed was put 0, and it was sold at the price B0. So now what happens? What is the new equilibrium, and where is the difference between the case in which a government is taxing the demand and the case in which the government decides to hit the suppliers of cigarettes in a perfect competitive market? We start exactly from the same equilibrium E0. So sorry, I interrupted.
First time, I think it's equilibrium reduced.
But which are the points in which it can lose? How can you find the equilibrium first? The new equilibrium in a competitive market. In this situation where either demand or supply is taxed. Can you see the new equilibrium at this point? Even those who are at home.
It's
Can you see the new equilibrium?
yeah, it's where the new demand curve meets with the supply curve.
There.
That means
So here we have this equilibrium in there. Like it's unequal, but the closer the meeting.
there are two concepts that we have to consider, but the answer is more or less because in a way she said equilibrium is where looking, she found the equilibrium. Sorry, for those at home, the suggestion was this point here, or in the case of demand, and this point here in the case of taxation of supply. It's not completely precise, but we have to look at this point. We are in a competitive market, so what the supplier wants is covering its costs as represented by the supply function. So, and how does it want to cover this cost? It just look at what exactly enters in its pocket after having sold the good. So what the supplier looks at is the demand net of taxation. So in a way, the net equilibrium is found in this point here, where we have a reduction of the quantity consumed from Q0 to Q prime, and the equilibrium price. Here we have a problem, because on the one side, the price which entered in the pocket, of course multiplied by quantity of the supplier, is what I called PN, okay, which means price net of taxation, which is the amount that allows the supplier to cover the production cost. Nevertheless, what is paid in the market by the consumers? We find the gross price for consumers. In this point here, I change color and make it green. What is paid in the market is the net price plus taxation. So it means that we have two prices. This is price, I call it PG because it's gross of taxation. Now, what happens in the case the supply is taxed by the government? In this case, of course, again, the producer wants to cover the production cost. So how can it cover the production cost? They consider the S plus T, the supply function after taxation, and look at whether, given this supply function, it can cover the cost, where it can cover the cost given the demand function, which is untouched. But this is the demand function, which is same as before. So this is the equilibrium price, which is, however, equilibrium price gross of taxation, because at this point here it includes in the cost of production the amount T of €1 for each package that the producer had to support given the government decision. So again, we have PG is the gross price, and PN is the net price, and Q prime is the new equilibrium for this market. So as you can see, it doesn't change anything in terms of equilibrium. What I mean is that if government decides that this is the market to be hit by taxation because it wants to reduce the consumption of this given good, assumed to be cigarette, and if government knows that this is a perfect competitive market, so it is indifferent to decide to tax either suppliers or consumers, because the equilibrium result doesn't change. And we can also see another bit that is important. Who is paying the tax? So the government, in either case, decided two different taxpayers, potential taxpayers. In this case here, government decided to tax the consumers. In this case here, the government decided to tax the producer. Now, we have seen that at the end of the day, the equilibrium is the same in terms of quantity and price, gross and net. But now we want to know two things. Who is paying the tax? And the second is what is the effect, what is the difference between the two markets? Have you Any idea of who is paying the tax in this market? In either case. Sorry?
Could you please repeat?
The question is, who is paying the tax? Well, look first on important things. Which is the amount of revenue that government can earn by taxing this good? The amount of good that at the end of the day is taxed is that we found at the new equilibrium, so it is Q prime, okay? This is the amount, the quantity of goods after the adjustment. And which is the amount that enters for government as revenue for taxation of cigarettes. This is given by the product of Q prime by T, which is the specific tax rate of €1 for each quantity that government decided in order to hit the market of cigarettes. So can you see now which is the revenue for the government of this kind of taxation, which it's both the side of the market? Is the product of T, so T is the difference, the distance, in this case by the demand, the original one, and the demand net of T, of tax. So this is the amount of T, which I have to multiply for the equilibrium quantity Q prime, which is this P. And if I multiply this to quantity by tax rate, the amount that government earns is given by this rectangle here, okay, which is the amount of revenue from taxation on the demand. What happens if I tax instead the supply? The way of finding the revenue for government is the same, so the distance between the new equilibrium with this T and the quantity of equilibrium, which is Q prime. So the rectangle, I put a letter AG, okay, okay. So the rectangle in both cases, PN, K, EG, PG, is the amount of revenues that government can earn by taxing cigarettes. Now, go back to the question I met you. Who is paying the tax in this case? How can you see who is paying the tax and with respect to what is paying the tax? Because we have apparently two different situations. Part of the fact that we see the final equilibrium is the same, with the same quantity, the same price, gross and net. Now, I want to see who is paying tax. Is the consumer or the producer? Speak up. You have to shout.
Producer.
Producer. No, speak up. The point is
Producer.
that. So there is one answer here suggested that the producer is the taxpayer, having all the tax burden. Any other else? Another person is suggesting that both of them are paying tax. Any other suggestion?
I think the producer pays the tax and it's increasing the price for this product. And
you have seen, this is what happens. You can see. The producer assumes, in any case, incorporates the fact that the tax is introduced into this market, which means that in one case, he considers the potential revenue not longer equal to D, but equal to D minus T. In the second case, he incorporates the taxes, knowing that he is the taxpayer, and consider its production cost equal to S plus T. So in both cases, the producer are incorporated the taxation. But the point now is, at the end of the day, when we have found the new equilibrium, who is the subject, producer or consumer, who is paying the tax in this situation?
I think there is a final product that for
There is a final
product that consumer has to pay the tax, and there is a raw material that.
Yes, but we want to know the fact in real terms, and I got the answer, otherwise we spend time waiting for your fantasy in this story. But we have to consider what happens at the beginning. The comparison has to be done with the original equilibrium, which was in point A0. This was the original equilibrium, which was exactly the same. Now, with respect to the original equilibrium price, which was, that I'm marking with red here, what I can see is that part of the increase of price is paid by the producer. In both cases, is big. Is paid by the consumer. And the other bit of price increase is paid by the, I have to change the color, but I don't want this one. It's paid by the consumers. I look, this is actually, I could say that here. The distance AK is not a price increase, but is a reduction of cost. And this bit is paid by the producer because with respect to the original equilibrium of point B, you have to reduce the amount of quantity that is supplied in the market. What is paying the consumers is not paying the full amount of taxation, €1, but depending on what? Can you see on what it depends? The consumer is paying only a bit of the price, which is this bit here. So what has happened here is that assuming an increase of price equal to the tax rate, which is €1. At the end of the day, we didn't have an increase of the equilibrium price equal to the tax rate, but a lower amount of it, and which is only partially paid by the consumer. And it depends, we will see it later, by the elasticity of demand and supply, because you can easily see, no, you will see, we will see it later, but now look at who is paying the tax. I mentioned that Altina and Zamirova is, I mentioned before that the government, from taxing cigarettes in both cases, has this amount of money. Okay, and given that we have to share this with respect to the original equilibrium price, the part paid by the consumer of taxation, that one I'm marking in red, this bit of the revenue, is paid by the consumers, which observes a reduction of the consumer surplus. Okay, which before was available to him. Whereas the part in green is paid by the producer, which has reduced the quantity sold in the market, and it faces a higher price. So given also the elasticity of supply, a bit of taxation is paid by him. And it is in a competitive market of the same amount of that we observe when the supply is taxed. So it doesn't matter if the market is competitive, who is the taxpayer, either producer or consumer, it doesn't make any difference. And what makes a difference in paying taxes is the extent of elasticity of demand and supply with respect to price. Okay, because you could see easily that if I have a situation like this, but we will see better later. So assume a supply function like this and a very rigid demand like this. What happens to the equilibrium? We are in a perfect competitive market with an absolutely rigid demand function. What happens in this case? Well, if the tax is on the producer, we have a shift, a parallel shift of the supply function like this, S plus T, and equilibrium simply determines an increase of price, but the quantity remains the same, given that we are in the most rigid demand curve. But the same occurs in case that the government says, well, it is the consumer that has to pay the tax. So we don't see this bit, but anyway, the equilibrium is again found in this bit. So it doesn't change. We stay at QE, but the price is partially used net of taxation. Oops. The price net of taxation is the same as before, but the consumer has to add the tax, which is T, so the gross price in this case is PG equal to P and plus T. Okay, and all the amount, all the tax is supported by the consumer. So what is important if we want to use that taxation in order to address consumer preferences is to know exactly the reaction of consumers and producers to taxation, and in particular to elasticity of demand and supply. Also because depending on the elasticity of demand and supplies, we can disentangle an effect which is considered important in terms of optimal taxation, which is that I called before deadweight loss. The deadweight loss is a loss that either consumer, and both consumer and producer are supporting simply because there is taxation. What does it mean? That when I switch from I clean it up. The equilibrium is 0 to the equilibrium A prime, and this is the original BG, and this is BN. If you remember the story of consumer surplus that we have already used for Marshall at the beginning. Now we observe that there is a loss of both consumer and producer surpluses, net surpluses. Why? Because at first we have an equilibrium in E0 at the price T0, which implied a consumer surplus equal to the triangle, put some letter P, E0, PN. This triangle was the original consumer surplus at the initial equilibrium. Okay, what happens after the introduction of that? I have to switch the equilibrium from E0 to E prime to E prime here, and in this point, O prime, the consumer surplus net of price and expenditure and taxes is given by the triangle in green, this one. B, E prime, PG. What about the producer surplus? At first, when we have the equilibrium equal to A0, the producer surplus was given by the area K E0 PM. Okay. Then when the equilibrium has moved at equilibrium A prime, the surplus for the producer is the triangle, I need a letter, K, B, G, K, G, and Z. So we observe the reduction of both producer and consumer surplus. And how this reduction has ended? Well, part of it, so we have a big triangle of consumer surplus, which is now reduced. The reduction is in part used by government. Part of it becomes revenue for government. In particular, the rectangular red, GZ, E prime, PG, this area here, is something money entering in the cash of the government. Okay. Whereas there are a big triangle, well, big, not big, Z, E0, E prime, which is a loss of both consumer and producer surplus, which does not enter in the cash of the government. So this is the reason why it is called deadweight loss, because we have a loss of surplus that does not favor the government. So in all of those cases in which we have a big deadweight loss, it means that taxation is not very efficient, but we might not care of efficiency of taxation in cases of floods. Why? Because we doesn't care of having an optimal tax system when we want people don't smoke, don't drink alcohol, or the like. We just want the most effective way able to affect their choice. So the most efficient taxes that can be used for a reduction of quantity. And so instead of looking only at specific taxation, we now look at a different taxation, which is quite often used for as excise tax or consumption tax, which is the so-called ad valorem taxation. For instance, the VAT in Europe is a consumption tax, which is ad valorem, because possibly even those from abroad who are in Italy have experienced that if you buy something in any shop, you have to add at the original price the VAT, which is proportional to the value of the good, it means to its price. And depending on the kind of good, you have to multiply the price by a given share, which can be 22%, 10%, or 4%, depending on the goods. So this is a different way of taxing consumption. And now we see, again, in a competitive market, the effect of an ad valorem taxation. Then the ad valorem tax being commiserated to the value of the good, its price, operates in a different way with respect to the specific taxation. In that, for instance, if I decide to tax a consumption, well, the demand for a given good, the law says, consumer has to be taxed at 10% of the value of the good they buy. It means that at each value of the good that I cannot serve just by looking at the demand curve, I have to work out the amount of 10% or 30%, whatever, that the government wants. And given that the tax rate applies at different prices, depending on where I am, the effect on the demand is a kind of rotation with respect to the original. At first, in the specific case, we have a sheet, a parallel sheet of the down low of the demand curve. In this case, we have a rotation that determines, which is determined by the tax rate, which is I called tau, which determines the rotation. It means that I'm changing the slope of the potential revenue that the firm is. The demand curve, well, the new potential revenue for the supplier passes from D, the original demand coordinate of taxation, to D times 1 minus tau, which is the new potential revenue pool. And the distance now is the real tax rate at a given quantity, because it says, as you can see, for each quantity, the tax rate is changing. Here is higher in absolute value. Is higher depending on the original demand curve, because I'm applying the same share tau at different value of the good. Okay. Again, what happens if I want to tax the supply? In this case, we have again a movement upward of the supply curve, but it's not parallel as before in the case of specific taxation on supply at AT, but we have a rotation of the supply curve, which depends again on the share of the value which is taxed. So this is the new supply curve, plus in this case 1 ops plus tau, which determines the new equilibrium. As before, in a perfect competitive market, it doesn't matter whether I decide that the taxpayer is the producer of the consumer, because as you can see, this picture, the final result is always the same as passed from E0, which is the original equilibrium result, which is assumed to be the same, to AG which is the equilibrium gross of taxation, with PG and PN being the price net and gross of taxes. The amount that government can earn in this case is given by the rectangle that I'm marking in red, this one. And as before, given that the comparison in order to see who is paying the tax must be done at the original equilibrium, you see that part of the tax is paid by consumers, this red. In either case, is the same. And the other bit is paid by the producer. And even in this case, we have equal to this rectangle here, and a part of the debt loss is paid by the producer, and the other bit is paid by the consumer. In particular, this bit of the rectangle of the triangle is paid up by the consumer, which is exactly the same in the two cases. And which color are you using? I'm using the green bit is paid by the producer. So doesn't matter who is the taxpayer, we have the same equilibrium, and again, depending on the fact that government can obtain by introducing taxation, it means depending on whether the government wants to make cash to spend as it wants, it has to be careful of taxing those goods, and it doesn't want to alter enough the market. It has to consider those goods which are more rigid. In case the government want to change the attitude of consumer to that, as we want here, the government might choose to tax those goods whose demand possibly is more elastic because it's the most reactive and to consumer choices. I mean, the consumer reacts very well to market, but we cannot decide always. And we can expect a quite strong reduction of the equilibrium quantity, in spite of the fact that the revenue is also reducing. So when I mentioned, for instance, the effect of taxation for junk food, and I mentioned a measure that was used by the Hungarian government some years ago, it was clear that in that case, the government, it was quite high, and it was very convenient for the government, but not convenient in the sense that it was expected. Because the government wanted to reduce the consumption of junk food by introducing taxation on fat, sweet, what else, sugar, whatever, food, drinks, and whatever. And it gave quite a big amount of money to the government because it was eating almost everything. But the effect in terms of reduction of dangerous goods, it wasn't too good. And indeed, all the prints, not only the specific journal, recognized the fact that in that case, the Hungarian government wants to make money by taxing good. Not, it didn't want exactly the reduction of consumption of junk food. A different situation was that in Denmark, which it was very effective, taxation used by government of fat food, but mainly it was eating specifically those foods, having a quite high amount of butter, cream, and the like. But notice that Denmark is also a country in which there is an absolutely high consumption of this kind of goods. And deciding to have a policy like this meant, in that case, determining a kind of revolution in the habits of standard consumers. And there was an effect in terms of reduction of certain consumption that the government considered bad. But it was such that the population did not accept it, and immediately after, it lasted even for a short time, much shorter than that measure of the Hungarian government. The government had to withdraw the measure because the population did not accept it. Mainly because it is not in principle a good thing to do, and apparently, as I mentioned, 2 lectures ago, the measure that government can use, not for cigarettes, well, even for cigarettes, but mainly for food, have been shown to be advertisement. And in a double sense, in a way, it must be bounded consumption, not only consumption, advertisement of the budget that we want to eat. On the other side, we want to advertise the dangerous effect of the consumption of these goods, because even advertisement was a measure that government used, for instance, for cigarettes or for food or for alcohol. They must be calibrated in a proper way. And in the United States, first, no, it was not the first who banned the advertisement of cigarettes. I don't remember in which country, but the story was that given that the government had banned the advertisement of cigarettes and alcohol, there is no reason to say that cigarettes and alcohol are dangerous for health. So the joint effect of banning advertisement on cigarettes and stopping the advertisement of the danger of cigarettes had, but I don't remember the country, the negative effect of increasing the amount of cigarettes that were consumed. And for cigarettes, for instance, it didn't work. And if calibrated, if better calibrated with other measures, for instance, advertisement and labeling for junk food might be much better than taxation of food. And the country that tried first this effect of joining taxation, advertising and labeling was UK, where at a certain point it decided to avoid taxation and was left on a mount of some campaigns supporting the good effect of good nutrition habits, but also selling a number of products with a traffic light signal, which is something that now the European Union is discussing to have, which means that if in the label of whatever product you see the red label, it means that it is dangerous. And the label must also explain why it is dangerous, for instance, because the fat inside the battery saturated fat is too high, or the sugar is above the level that can be tolerated, or whatever. And if you have red light, green light, or which is where the yellow light, you can recognize immediately, even if you don't know exactly which is the problem with that good, you are in a way oriented in the good. Now, before we have to see two other things related to taxation, which are important. One is the effect on monopoly. What happens if instead of taxing a perfect competitive market, I decide to tax a monopolist? Well, for the sake of simplicity, I assume that the monopolist is maximizing its profit. So if price maker maximizes its profit, and so reminder, we just look at the situation in which we have a specific tax on supply. We assume a simplified, very simple supply function where the marginal cost, which is equal to marginal cost, which is in turn equal to average cost, and we use supply as tax basis, and so we introduce a specific tax on supply, which means that both marginal cost and average cost are shifted upward, and the new supply function after taxation becomes S plus T. And if we were in the situation in a competitive context, the equilibrium would pass, as we have seen before, from EC to AC prime, which would be the new equilibrium price in case of a perfect competitive market, where the price, given that supply curve is parallel to horizontal axis, the price increase is equal to the amount of the specific taxation that we have decided. So the net consumer price is equal to this PC. The net equilibrium price after taxation corresponds to the competitive price that we have at the beginning, and the gross price PG corresponds to PC prime, which is PC plus T. Okay, this is the new gross equilibrium price at the new equilibrium in a situation where supply curve is parallel to horizontal axis and in a competitive market. What happens in a monopoly? In this case, we have to consider the fact that the monopolist is maximizing his price, his profit. Sorry. So what changes is this situation. Look at first at the equilibrium for a monopolist, which will be the situation to be considered when we are going to tax, for instance, cigarettes, because the market for cigarettes is a bit complicated because it is composed by different branches in a way. It's not the right word, but in a way there is a bit of high quality cigarettes which are devoted to a given target of consumers. And that part of the market is a monopolistic competition, where we can assume that the producer are making the price. It might be profit maximization or the like. Then there is another bit of cigarette which is in a way not it's still called cigarette, but those cigarettes are not perfect substitute of the former market. So if I smoke high quality cigarettes and the price increases, it's quite difficult that I switch to that part of the market in which But if inside of the brand I smoke low quality tobacco, it doesn't happen. There is a kind of stiffness of consumer to the level of cigarettes. And so we have, we can quite correctly consider these two bits of the market as separate. And also consider that not all the brand of cigarette or the kind of cigarette are substitutes for each other. It doesn't matter. It might even happen that cigarettes can be substitute to cigars, or that someone smoking cigarettes switch to something completely different, which is not typical blonde, but is something different than cigarette roll or cigars or pipe or whatever. But it's very difficult that high quality smokers switch to low quality tobacco products. So in this case, it must be considered because it's quite important that the consumer attitude to the kind of tobacco is smoking. Because, by the way, tobacco is the element that determines the addiction of the consumers, which is quite different from the kind of addiction that can be given by alcohol. So for, well, it might be difficult that incredibly high quality consumers of alcohol, which are expected to be rich because the price of the brand of alcohol is quite different depending on the quality of it. Switches to low quality, but on average, for alcohol, you can easily see switches from high quality to medium high quality to low quality if the prices increases. This happens because the element which generates addiction is the pure alcohol, which is not exactly the same with cigarettes, because it has been shown that there are some additives in cigarettes that makes them different. So if I cannot afford, because of my budget, my daily consumption of pure alcohol of high quality, in order to be satisfied as addicted, I can definitely buy something very low quality. And this has been observed in the UK, for instance. There are some studies that, for instance, this mainly happens for less affluent families or addicted or poor people, in which case, if the problem is alcohol, they indeed, they can even switch to drink something that is not drinkable because it's dangerous, like the alcohol that is used for cleaning or the like, which is in Italy it's called denaturated, which means that some elements that makes not drinkable have been added to ethylic alcohol that can be used for acting. So in that way, you can buy at the supermarket pure denaturated alcohol that is used by the cleaner, for instance, or is used in the hospital for disinfecting, which, however, cannot be drunk. Okay, but now go back to the monopolies. What happens in the monopolies case? So, as before, AC prime are the competitive equilibrium in presence of competition, but now we have to look at what happens if I am going to tax the monopolies. And we start from the marginal and average cost of which are the same, and the demand and marginal revenue, which are these two, that are necessary to consider the equilibrium, to find the equilibrium for a monopolist. Because in case of monopolist, the monopolist maximizes profit, subject to is budget constraint. So if you remember, we have already seen it, we have to fix the price such that the first order conditions are satisfied. So we have marginal cost equal to marginal revenue. So the equilibrium in our case is found where the marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. This is the marginal cost. This is the marginal revenue. So in this way, I found the quantity that maximizes gross it, and it is QM. And on this basis, I also find the price, the monopoly price, which is PM. Okay. And in this way, I also find look at the profit for the monopolist, which is equal to the rectangle in red. This is the monopoly price. And also I can find the consumer surplus in this monopoly market where the monopolist is price neck. Okay, now look at the situation and what happens if the monopolist is the one who is hit by the tax. So the marginal and average cost was switched from S to S plus T. So now we have to reconsider the equilibrium, and we have again our marginal revenue, which is this line. But now the marginal cost is S plus E, this one. So we can find the equilibrium in this point. So when marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, the new marginal cost is this one. And the equilibrium switches from QM, this is the quantity that maximize the profit, and now I have the equilibrium, the new monopoly equilibrium price, where what has changed in this situation if government is taxing a monopolist? Well, of course, it changes both prices, which increases, and quantity, which is reduced. But which is the effect in terms of taxation and in terms of reduction of the quantity consumed? Notice that, for instance, if you look at the situation in which I was taxing this market, I have this amount of reduction in the equilibrium quantity. So the specific taxation was quite effective. Now, in the case of monopoly pricing, the reduction of quantity is lower. And why is such? Because in a way, this is not a surprise, in a way, because what happens is that by definition, and you already know the story, there is a kind of rationing when under a monopoly situation, because consumers afford a situation in which the price is at the beginning higher and the quantity is lower. There is a kind of rationing, which is due to the monopoly. But what happens if I'm going to tax it? So we have to see whether it was a good or bad effect, and what the government, which was the result for government now, and who is paying the tax, and who is the person who mainly suffer from taxation in this situation, which we do not like very much, because there is the producer who is using his monopoly price, and so decides the price in spite of consumer wishes. So look at first at the revenue for government. Can you see the revenue for government after taxation? So at first, remind the government had no revenue And all this area in red was the extra profit for the monopolist. Extra profit because he could obtain the rents which were not paying the production factor, because it is simply determined by its monopoly condition. So it is an extra profit, because by definition the cost function contains also the payment for, say, for the trainer, for any production factor. So what is gained is extra. It is, but possibly now you cannot see this in the bond market, but you can see on the energy prices. And they are determined by an exogenous shock, which is due to the situation between Russia and the rest of the world. And what happens because of the fluctuating prices at international level is a situation in which the monopolist, which is, I'm not referring to Russia, Gazprom, I'm referring to those buying from Russia, are exploiting the fact that the market is fluctuating in the price of gas. And so there is a situation for which the same product, gas, that they can have bought before at a given price is increased without any economic reason because of the international market. And now those who are reselling the gas in the country, for instance in Italy, are making extra profits with respect to the standard remuneration that they faced before. Well, they were in a good position because they were buying gas or energy all over the world. But because of this situation, and given that because of the types of good we are considering in the world of energy, that for instance, you can store the gas and you can buy it at a different time. So all those who had bought the gas before the change of the world of energy because of the war are making now extra profit, which are not due to the fact that the Gazprom is increasing the price. Of course, also Gazprom is increasing the price, and if someone pays, can make extra gains. But also those who have bought before the gas and now can sell it at the current price are making extra profit. And so at first, those extra profits are equal to the yellow area market in red. What happens after taxation? I switch to the equilibrium EM prime. And the first, which is the amount of taxation at this new equilibrium? I mark it in yellow. At this new equilibrium, can you see which is the amount of revenue for government? Notice that at first I told you that there is a specific taxation on the good, which means a unit tax which is equal for each quantity of the good. So assuming that this is the monopoly, the tobacco monopoly, and I have decided €1 per package of cigarettes, I have to see the amount sold at the new equilibrium after taxation, and I have to multiply it by the tax rate, which is €1. So I have to multiply T, small t, which is tax rate, times the 2M1 is big, which is the quantity of equilibrium. So T by 2M1 is the amount of tax revenue, which in the picture corresponds to the product of T, this is T, times the quantity. So the rectangle marked in green is the amount of revenues that government gains. Okay. So now look at which part of extra profit is going to the firm after taxation, to our monopolies. Remind that the rectangle was the original extra profit for the firm. Now, what happens after taxation? We have this new equilibrium, and the difference between the final consumer price, which is PM1, this one. Now I have to change color and I put a different color. Say, wow. Which color do you want? Gold. Now, the profit is given by the difference, the unit profit is given by the difference between prices and average cost net gross of taxes. So the unit profit is not good, this color is better black. This is the unit profit that I have to multiply for the quantity of equilibrium, which is 2 and 1 again. So this bit. This is the extra profit for the firm after taxation. So you can see that there is a quite wide reduction of extra profit for the firm. What happens to the consumer? That was the person that we wanted to eat. Well, the consumer, if he wants to buy goods which are sold in a monopolistic way, is that agent after taxation loses less. But why? Because he is already exploited by the monopolistic situation. So if the consumer surplus switches from which color? This one. This triangle, which was the original, to the green triangle, that is this one. Now, notice that part of the consumer surplus of reduction of the consumer secured by the monopolist. As for this part, the state, it becomes rents for the monopolist. And also notice that quite a big part with respect to previous monopolistic situation is lost. So we have a quite big dead weight loss, which however has to be considered, which is not however so big as it was that we observed in the case of competition, because notice that I call it AM prime is the dead weight loss for the consumers in the monopolistic situation after taxation, which is much smaller as compared to the competitive situation, because at first it was this triangle here. And even as a consequence, even the reduction of consumption of the bats is much lower if, unfortunately, the market that I'm going to eat is a monopolistic one. So this is a case in which the use of only excise taxation might not work properly. Well, Haiti, every the monopolist and it determines quite a strong reduction of monopoly rents. But actually, the person which suffer, and it might be good if the government wants to use taxation for reducing the monopoly price, but it's not actually very good, at least alone. It must be, it wants to be used as a way, a means to reduce the consumption of the good. Last bit, a very short one, what I want to show you is a comparison between the use, we will see only the competitive market, the use of a specific and an ad valorem taxation. In both cases, I'm using the consumer as taxpayer, and we are in perfect competition, so it doesn't matter. But what we want to see is the kind of a further kind of effect that the use of this different form of taxation can have on consumer habits. Mainly because if you look at it in a dynamic term, the effect, there can be a quite important enhancement effect, which is quite often used. For instance, in those countries where the introduction of excise taxation can occur by decree, which means that the government decides of introducing a given tax, and if it enters by decree, which is a juridic instrument that is government can use as the power of law, but the government can use it very quickly because it decides, and after 24 hours it enters into force without the approval of the parliament that must arrive later on after 30 days. So for instance, all the time that government wants to introduce new taxes on cigarettes or new taxes on polluting goods like gas or petroleum derivatives or even subsidy. Now the government is trying to contain the price of gas with a measure that subsidizes the price, but in order to avoid strange behavior, it introduced it after the 24 hours from the decision in order to not to give to the consumer and producer any way for a just and avoid the measure that the government wants to introduce. So if the government wants to change the price of cigarette and for this reason introduces a tax of €1 per package, and doesn't want because it wants that consumer reduce the amount of cigarettes that they smoke. It doesn't want that consumer makes buys a more enormous amount of cigarettes. That all the house is full of cigarettes simply because he knows that the price is increasing after a month or after a parliamentary discussion. So it introduced it by decrease. And now what we are looking at is whether it makes a difference to use a specific or ad valorem tax. The original equilibrium is zero, and it is a competitive one. And the case in which the government decides to tax the demand, the consumer, the effect from a producer's point of view is to have a reduction of the potential revenue that passes from D to D minus T. So this is what I'm marking is the new potential revenue from the point of view of the producer. And if the government, no, what happens if the government introduces a specific tax like this, then the premium net of taxes is here, gross of taxes go to A prime. In this case, given that we have an horizontal supply curve, all the taxes paid by the consumer, because being horizontal, the supply doesn't change after the introduction of tax. So what changes is the amount of quantity in equilibrium, which is reduced, and it goes to 1. And in this case, all the tax is paid by the consumer that see quite a strong reduction of the surplus equal to the yellow area. Okay, it's more or less as before. Now, assume this exercise, I am the government, and at the end of the day, I'm comparing two forms of taxation of this same good, and I want at the end of the day the same revenue from the taxation, either specific or ad valorem. So I know that by introducing the specific taxation on this good, I have a revenue equal to PC, K, A1, and Z. Okay. Now, I want to see what happens if I introduce an ad valorem taxation that gives me the same amount of revenue. So at the end, I want to obtain a revenue equal to the yellow area. How can work out the amount of the rate for an ad valorem taxation? So I know that in order to find equilibrium, I want that the specific taxes passes from here. Okay. How I wanted that an ad valorem tax give me the same amount of revenue. It means that I want to obtain the same equilibrium, and I want that the specific, the ad valorem tax rate determines a reduction of the demand or the potential revenue, such that it passes from the point, the equilibrium net of taxes. Okay, so I'm imposing that after the ad valorem taxation is decided, the new potential revenue for the firm passes through, which originates by this point, because when the price is 0, this is the point that saturates the demand, and the willingness to pay here is 0. And when the price is 0, the 10% of 0 is 0. So I know first that the new demand curve, the new potential revenue starts from here, and I want that it also passes through point K. So I impose this movement of the rotation of the demand curve. Fancy. Okay. And I impose this constraint here and here, so the new potential revenue for the producer, in order to have the same effect, is the red one. Now, which is the difference in this car? In this case, I know that at the end, the effect of the two forms of taxation is the same in terms of equilibrium. So there is a reduction of the quantity, the equilibrium quantity, a reduction of price, but which is the advantage or disadvantage of using one type or the other type of taxation? So if our Q was cigarette or alcohol, for which I want to have, and I know that after a while I will obtain the same quantity, but which is the best instrument that I should use? Given that consumers, in any case, needs some adjustments. If my impact is to reach what I want to reach soon, action of quantity and the same effect. The best thing to do is that of using a specific taxation, because if I'm using ad valorem taxation, I have an announcement effect, given that at first, at the original equilibrium, what the government can do is only say what is the amount of the rate with respect to the original price at this equilibrium is 0. And the tax rate is the amount T, this one, green, for the specific tax. But given the equilibrium price is lower and the ad valorem tax is commiserated to the price, the ad valorem unit rate is much lower with respect to the specific tax. So in a way, by announcing that immediately the effect is quite a big tax rate, I discourage the consumers for all the time they need for adjustment. So, for instance, if you see this kind of taxation for an opposite point of view, and we are going to tax a merit food, not the merit like cigarette, but I need taxation. I want to tax something that, for some reason, is considered a merit food, and possibly I want to tax factor of production. But I do not want to discourage firms because if I'm taxing production factor, for instance, say firms are going to plus their firm abroad because here it's too expensive because of taxation. So if I want to slow this process of adjustment, which does not occur simultaneously, what I can do is choosing, in case of a merit food, the ad valorem taxation, which in a way is at the original equilibrium, is less impressive than the specific one. And so, in a way, maybe the taxpayers are ready to suffer, or anyway, suffer less than in the case of ad valorem taxation. Okay. So you know almost everything. You will also find, but I won't give you the demonstration of the story. But in the site, it is also just there is a bit of story related to the excess burden or the dead weight loss, which is this triangle, and you can see that I shall not show it, how this can be translated in terms of elasticity of demand and progressivity of taxation and volume of affairs. And you also can see how the excess margin changes depending on whether the demand is very rigid, as in this case, where we don't have excess margin, that weight loss, or whether the demand is more or less elastic, and how the different equilibrium changes, and in particular, how the excess margin might change in these two cases. It passes from 0 in this case, an absolutely rigid demand, and the triangle increases when for the red demand, and it's higher when the demand is more elastic. Okay, any question? Are you going to die? Not right now. Like so. Quite good.
We have
It's
another
not
class.
good. Eh?
We have another class.
Sorry. Well, anyway, in case you will see next year, soon,